Welcome to My Life, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tevach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya. This program is made possible by Arena Lights LLC and is in honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Alevi Weinberg Olav Hashalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKoyen Katz Olav Hashalom, Rabbi Yoel HaKoyen Khan Olav Hashalom. And it is in schus and merit of Rabbi Zev Yecheskel and HaKoyen and Risha Katz, Eidach Yomim V'Shonim Tevis for many long, healthy years. We finished chapter 7 in Tanya, Perek Zayin, and we are beginning Perek Ches. So we did a beginning of Perek Ches last week, but we're going to start again in a full, more comprehensive way. We did it more like in the transition from 7 to 8. So Perek Ches. If you're following along, let's start Perek Ches of Tanya. Short introduction, that we're still in the middle of the discussion that began chapter 6, which is the Zelu Umazeh Osa Lakim. Zelu Umazeh meaning the other side of Sitra Achre, Klippa and Sitra Achre. The other side of what? Of Gedusha. Because existence is created Zelu Umazeh, like parallel worlds, like a mirror image, alter ego. Kedusha and holiness is the divine soul described in chapter 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. But now we return to the animal soul that was discussed in the end of chapter 1. So chapter 5, 6, chapter 6, 7, 8 are all about the other side. And we discussed at length what that means. Which of course identifying in our own personal lives is the key to it all. We have within us two voices, two souls, two psyches, two entities. Later in chapter 9, we're going to discuss of how they confront each other. But chapters 2 through 5 talks about the Nefesh Elikis, the divine soul, the voice of transcendence, the voice that seeks to fulfill the purpose, the divine purpose and mission of its life. And the second soul, Nefesh Abam, is the animal soul, is focused on survival, its own egocentric needs, self-interest. So of course there's immediate clash between the two. But we're not talking about the actual clash right now, we're talking about their identities and their effect on us. And in the Alter Rebbe's classic fashion, just as he did with the divine soul, he now does it with the animal soul to explain all the aspects and the different scenarios of how this animal soul manifests in our lives. Generally, two types of klippas, two types of shells. Shell is the Kabbalistic terminology for what? For the divine that's concealed within a husk, within a shell, within a klippa. Now, there are two types of klippas. There's the harsh klippas, the three, shalosh klippas atmez, the three impure husks that are completely off limits. And then there's klippas nega, the radiant, the bright klippa. That's more transparent, that allows the light in, but it's still with a husk because it's still part of this material existence. The difference between a dover osir and a dover mutter. A dover mutter means it's unbound, it's unchained. Mutter. Osir means it's bound and chained. So when he says osir v'kosher b'deach etzenim, means the divine spark within it is off limits, it's chained, it's being held hostage. And that's why we're supposed to avoid it. That's the mitzvah, is to avoid it. Refrain. Klippas nega is the activities we're involved in. Because the spark is unchained. You're able to free it. You're able to elevate it. If you indeed eat and drink and behave, all your actions, thoughts, and speech are directed toward heavenly intentions, so then that spark, that divine spark, is not trapped. It can be elevated, as we discussed in chapter 6. However, the things that are trapped or chained, those are the sparks those are the dvarim asurim that are bound and chained and off limits. And if God forbid a person does indeed get involved in them, so then they cannot be redeemed until Mashiach comes, when all the toxins will be freed, or through tshuva and the different types of tshuva we discussed at the end of chapter 7. The deepest tshuva ma'ava that can extract even those sparks, as he explained, but even there's even a lower tshuva, nechena, that you can extract and you can elevate the sparks from the wasted seed. However, when it comes to illicit relations with another person, so there he says there you're not even tshuva ma'ava, because there's a container, there's another individual, and the toxins have taken hold, like mu'uva she'eni yochel esaken, like he said, an illegitimate child born out of it. So there you need to have what he said is even beyond tshuva ma'ava, something that's completely, he doesn't even describe that to him. That we have to wait till Mashiach comes. As he explained at the end of chapter 7. There is a tshuva that is so powerful that can do that, but that's already an exception, as we discussed in the previous class. Now, in chapter 8, he continues. Since he brought already bias asuras, and the second category is macholas asuras, these are the two main categories. Even though there are other things that are forbidden, we already discussed from the Shalah, those are the two main things that occupy a person's life, because, of course, we all eat, and we're all involved in relations. We have marriage. So those are the areas that need the most care, and they're most all-consuming. They create, and there's something that is on a daily basis we have to struggle with. So now in chapter 8, he's going to go back and continuing the themes of other scenarios describing the issue of macholas asuras. That in a certain instance, you're going to find that it has some element that makes it even more trapped than bias asuras. In addition, he's also going to focus on other scenarios, just like he spoke earlier, that you can do something that's negative can be turned into positive. Zdeinus naslei kezochias through tshuva ma'ava, a tshuva of love can transform the deliberate sins into merits. And the same thing when it comes to the sparks, I should have mentioned, klipas nega that enter temporarily into that domain of the negative can be elevated. How about the opposite? If a person eats something that is completely off limits, forbidden, prohibited, but he eats it with a good intention. So we're going to discuss all of this. But we're talking now about shalosh klipas atmeis in the context of macholas asuras. Bias asuras, illicit relations, was discussed at the end of chapter 7. Now we're going into macholas asuras. For Oidzai says the Alter Rebbe at the beginning of chapter 8, the macholas asuras. That in addition to what we learned till now, there's an additional element when you're dealing with forbidden non-kosher foods, which are called asures. They're chained. We're not talking about a kosher food that's neutral and can be used either way. We're talking about something that's chained, that's trapped. So he says, furthermore, that's why they're called isur. So here we're going to find something that even more than we find in what we discussed earlier. Because bias asur is the behavior of a person is not allowed. You're not allowed to have illicit relations. But the very idea of relations with your spouse in a kosher way is a mitzvah, actually. Here, there's another element. The very food, independent of our actions, is asur. The spark is trapped in the food. With a bias asuras, the whole thing is about relationships. There's no such thing as just an independent sexual toxic element. We're not talking about now wasted seed, unless a person has illicit relations. When it comes to the food, there is an independent element, the food itself. So what it's called asur, as we said before, isur, because it's bound, it's trapped, it's being held hostage, it's chained to the negative energy. Think of a black hole where the spark itself, the light itself, can't be freed. So he says, it's chained to an extent that even if a person eats this forbidden food, something non-kosher, inadvertently, He's not aware. And he's eating it l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. If he's aware, then it's not only that the food is off limits, then the person's actions are also part of the problem. But here we're talking, he does not aware. He doesn't know it's not kosher. So you would think it's all about his intentions. He's eating it l'shem shamayim. So it's not just he doesn't know it's not kosher, on the contrary, he's actually eating it for the sake of heaven. Laved Hashem b'keich achilahi. With intention to use the energy of the food, keich achilahi, to serve God. And not only is that the kavanah, it goes on. Not only is that the kavanah, v'gam Paul v'osakein. He actually fulfills it. He realizes that intention and does it. What does he do? He reads or studies Torah, reading, and prays with the strength that he gained from a non-kosher food. So it's not just his intention. So you would think, okay, 1 second. Why shouldn't this be directed toward heaven? He's not aware. If he was aware, you could say it's like echtev oshuv. Person is sinning intentionally doing something inappropriate to do something appropriate. That's not acceptable. But here he's talking about he's not aware. It's inadvertent. And he's directing it. He's eating the food exactly as he would have eaten a kosher food. And with that, he davens, he studies and he learns. He studies and he prays. Nevertheless, ein achayis shebo elo mislabeshes b'tevis haTorah v'atfilah. The chayis, the energy that is received from the food, does not elevate and does not become uplifted and dressed and manifest in the words of Torah and prayer, Torah and Tefillah, the words of Torah and Tefillah, prayer, that he's saying. Because the way it is, if it was a kosher food, kamoya heter, in a kosher food, then of course the energy that's in it, since it's not trapped, and now you're using the strength from eating that kosher food to learn and to pray, so that energy within the food is part of the elevation and the experience of learning and praying. But here, because the spark is trapped, it's not elevated through Torah and prayer. It's like two separate things. You take a learned and davened, and you get rewarded for that. That's fine. But the energy of the food has not been elevated. Why? Because it is chained. Surah, from the word like Beis Asurim, a prison. Osid is a prisoner, because it's in prison, it's being held hostage in the hands of the Sitra Achim, not literally the hands, it means in the control of the negative forces of the other side, Misholosh Klippas Hatmeis, from the 3 impure husks. So you see the extent, because the object itself is off limits. It would be, just to use an example, it would be like a person is doing something destructive, and out of the destructive thing, he's building something positive. Let's say someone hurts another person, and then they cut a little of their skin, and they use the skin to save somebody. I'm not talking about in medical conditions, I'm not talking about where it's allowed al pi Torah, if it's allowed at all, to save a life. We're talking about somebody who does something, a crime. I mean, I don't want to mention the Nazis, but they did that. And then they use the very crime itself for something positive. Just an example. It's not exact. So you cannot say, it's been redeemed. No, because the crime is a crime. That spark was meant to be off limits. That food is not meant to be eaten. It's prohibited. It's toxic. So even though, let's say, somebody ate poisonous food, and with that they did something positive, still poisonous food. If God blesses them, it may not affect them. But it does affect. It's still toxic. That's the point here. And this is the dover nesev. You don't have this in illicit relations. Because there, as I said, doesn't have an objective element there. You're not dealing with an object that's off limits. There you're dealing with a behavior that's off limits. And here you're dealing with both things, the object and the behavior. Now, if the behavior is also not l'shem shamayim for the wrong thing, so everything is negative. The object that you've consumed that's unkosher, and the behavior is a destructive one. But even if the behavior is a kosher one, but it's coming from the toxic element of the food that's prohibited, ein achayis shebo eila. It does not get elevated. Now remember, this is all, and he makes he's going to, the qualification, of course, would be if you did tshuva ma'ava afterwards. But that's a whole other story. Because tshuva ma'ava introduces another force here. The force that can extract that spark. But that's not what we're addressing now. So you see how the Alter Rebbe is adding what's so important to mention all of this, why it was enough what we read in chapter 6 and 7, because these scenarios are not covered. And it's critical to cover to understand really what is off limits in this world. We need to understand it's not your intention alone that matters. It's also the very experience that you're doing. And in that sense, it has that effect. Okay. Now I should just add, it does say in Sfarim, that Irachaim, that Ramban, others talk about that why one of the effects, one of the reasons, or one of at least the consequences, when you eat unkosher food, which comes in many cases from predators and aggressive animals, we assume the properties, we assume the personality of the food we eat. You are what you eat. You assume what you consume. So therefore it has an effect on you. The Alter Rebbe doesn't bring that here, but it just adds to the understanding. Why? Why can't you just say that the spark is elevated and that's that? No, because you have eaten something that's off limits, something toxic. Doesn't matter what your intention is in this sense. So if you eat something that's affecting your personality, and the fact that you also use that strength to do something positive, it still does not take away the effect that it has. Because the fact is you've consumed something that was off limits. Okay. However, kamaya heter, when it comes to davar muter, that's not the case. So continuing on now. In the thoroughness of the Alter Rebbe, this covers isurim daraisa, things that the Torah, the written Torah, tells us are off limits. Obviously, God created the world, and He said there are three categories. There are things that you must do, a mitzvah. There are things that you're not allowed to do, off limits, and there are things that are neutral. Dvarim mutarim, you could do, or you do because you need to survive, and it can go in either direction, like we said earlier in chapter 7. A klipa mumutzas, it's an interface, an in between the two. So the Torah designates that. But we know that in Torah mitzvahs, there's also a whole body of Torah shebal peh, oral Torah. Dvorim asurim midrabona, osir midrabona. How about that category? There you could argue l'cheira, seemingly, that since it's human beings, as great as they were, but it's not God, do they have if they say something is forbidden to be eaten, though the daraisa it's not, what effect does that have? There you could say that that's more of a superimposed thing, and it doesn't fundamentally change the reality of existence. So there, if you eat it l'shem shamayim, perhaps you were allowed to elevate, you're able to elevate it. Says the Alter Rebbe, no. Even when it's a rabbinic prohibition, which is made by people, Tanoim, Amaroim, Rabbanon, Chazal, that for whatever the reason is, they've said certain things are off limits, so it's a Issa de Rabbanon. Nevertheless, it also has the power to change the reality. Why? Because shechamurim divrei sofrim yesem divrei Torah. the words of the scribes, which means of the rabbis, are even more stringent than the words of the Torah, says the Gemara in Edison, Chafal of Beis, 21b. So even though it doesn't have the same authority in the level of severity or strength as a Torah Shebiksav, however, these are not Stam rabbis. These are people who are coming b'koyach Hashem, b'koyach HaTorah. They have the power of Torah. So if they say something's forbidden, the spiritual energy in that object, the spark, is actually changed from Klippas Nega to Sholosh Klippas Atmeis. Because initially it was not forbidden, it was mutter. And nevertheless, they made it also. So even though they did it, and it's not in the initial written Torah, that too causes us not to be able to elevate it. Even when it's done, b'lo heida, inadvertently, and l'shem shamayim, for good intentions, for the sake of heaven. Now, just to explain this a bit further, because seemingly you could say, 1 second. It's just as we said, Apesha Asur, Apesha Hitter. The same God that said it's bound and trapped or chained also said it can be freed, for example, in the circumstance of Pekuach Nefesh. If a person's at danger, it's a mitzvah actually to eat something forbidden if there's no other food, on Yom Kippur even, to eat pork. It's the only thing that will save his life. Why? Because the same God that said it's off limits said, now I'm freeing it under these circumstances. So why can't you say that the same is with L'Shem Shemayim? If you eat it L'Shem Shemayim, and Lo Yehoide, you don't know, why can't God say that that's also freed? But that's not what God did. Because even Klippas Nega, you can make the argument. You could say it doesn't go down into the darkest toxic place of Sholosh Klippas Atmeis. But how could you elevate it to Kedusha? God created it in the domain of Rishus, of Chayil. It's a mundane activity. How could you compare, for example, walking the street and being in a shul, in a synagogue? Or a weekday to a Yom Kippur or to a Shabbos? Or any location on earth compared to the Holy Temple? There are things that are holy, things that are not. So who said you can elevate that to holiness, to Kedusha, and we said we could? So that taka needs a chiddush. God says, I am telling you, you can do that. That's the purpose of existence. I've embedded in you and in existence the power to elevate physicality and spiritualize the material. But there's a condition. There are things where it's off limits. You can't do that. And the Rabbanon, I used to the Rabbanon have the wisdom, because remember, they're not coming with their own intelligence and wisdom. The wisdom of the Torah, they understand the time has come that this has to be forbidden. So that too goes into that category. And the way you elevate is by avoiding it. So you need a chiddush. It's a chiddush to elevate something from one domain to another. So in Klippas Nega, we're told we can do it. But in Sholosh Klippas Atmeis, no. It doesn't matter what your intention is, as I explained earlier. U'lechein, the Alter Rebbe now continues. This now is going to come back to the person. Because till now we've been speaking about the very object, regardless of your intentions and behavior. Even if not only your intentions are good, but the intentions actually are actualized by using the strength of those forbidden foods to learn and to study and to pray. But we're talking about that very object. What about the person? So he's now going to say that the mere fact that it has that power, independent of the person, also affects, that's why we're drawn to it. Why are you drawn to something that is of unholy spirit? Sholosh Klippas Atmeis, something so toxic, whether you know it or not. Why are you drawn to it? So he says, "U'lechein gam ha'yetzer hara v'koyach ha'mesavel l'dvarim ha'asurim." Therefore, the yetzer hara, the impulse to evil, and the desire for forbidden things, koyach ha'mesaveh literally means the power to desire. So we have the things, the objects that we desire, and there's the power that we desire. Why is the koyach ha'mesaveh, the yetzer hara, the koyach ha'mesaveh, going to these l'dvarim ha'asurim, things that are chained and off limits? So he's going to explain, because it's not coming from the sholosh klippa. It's not coming from the klippas nega of the animal soul. It's coming from somewhere else, from an external influence. And what is that? Whose shade Mishedin Nuchroyin. It's coming from the demon of the foreign demons. A concept explained in Zohar, Chele Gimel, Reish Nun Gimel Aleph 253a. So he's introducing a new concept, but it's connected to what? To the concept we talked earlier about Klippa, Sitra Achra, Le'umazeh, Shedin Nuchroyin. Excuse me. So it's coming from something else entirely. And what is the shade Nechroin? It says, Shu Yetzer Hara Shal Umas Ha'elam. This is the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination of the wicked nations of the world. Remember, in the end of chapter 1, we discussed at length and learned that there's the force of Shalosh Klipos Atmeis. In the nations of the world, we're talking about the wicked nations, the pagan nations. Evdei Avei Zara. So by them, we learned their spirits come from the three impure klippas. We're not talking about righteous Gentiles, which is the majority or even maybe all of the people in the world today. We're talking about this entity, and that's what's impacted this individual, the Yetzer Hara and his Koyach HaMesaveh, to be drawn to things that are off limits. Whereas, Mashenken HaYetzer Hara, by contrast, the evil inclination, the Koyach HaMesaveh, and the power of desire, l'dvarim hamutarim, to things that are permitted. So we can also have a desire for that. Kosher food, or other things that are permitted. L'mailis tevase, to satisfy his desire. So even though it's satisfying his desire, which means it's for his own purpose, but it's to something that's mutter, which means not chained, who's shade mishadin Yehudayin. So this Yetzer Hara and being drawn to things that are permitted is one of the Jewish demons. Yehudayin from the word Yehuda. Yehudi. Lefi sheyachal lachzer l'kedusha kedil'il. So even though the impulse is causing the person to deny God or forget God and focus on his own indulgence, but it can easily revert lachzer l'kedusha to holiness, as explained above, when a person realigns their intention, because it's a davar mutter fundamentally. And that's a distinction. So we have now another thing here, that in the Dvarim Asurim, the fact that we're drawn to it, not just that it itself, because it itself is off limits, it also causes us to be drawn to something that should be off limits. And that's why you can't elevate it. So we'll stop here on a positive note. He's telling the Alter Rebbe is explaining to us the world in which we live. And by knowing that, which you're not supposed to do is just as a blessing to know then what you should be doing. So it's giving us perspective on the paths of life, the paths to travel on and the paths to avoid. You can go to TanyaApplied.com for previous episodes and propose any questions. Everyone be well and have a good week.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.